Sandra sat on her bed that night, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her chest felt heavy, her heart burdened with questions, doubts, and disappointment. For the first time, she felt as though David, her wise and discerning David, had completely missed the handwriting on the wall. How could he not see it? How could he not sense the danger, the manipulation, the hidden agenda behind this so-called opportunity in South Africa? How could he be so quick to celebrate, to jump at the idea without a single moment of deep thought, without even praying? She felt a fresh wave of frustration. David, why? She whispered to herself. She had expected a different reaction. She had thought David would say, "Let's pray about it, let's seek clarity, let's weigh the situation like we did with Chief Martins." But instead, he had immediately seen it as their way of escape, their golden ticket to a fresh start. But was it? Couldn't he see the red flags? The signs were everywhere, clear, glaring, and unsettling. Her parents and Uncle Sunday. She remembered not too long ago, overhearing her parents talking about a business deal between Chief Martins and Uncle Sunday. She had dismissed it at the time. But now, the pieces were coming together. Had her parents briefed Uncle Sunday and solicited his help in convincing her to take the deal? Was this South Africa opportunity just another well-disguised trap? Uncle Sunday's sudden offer. Why now? Why did Uncle Sunday suddenly come with a study and work opportunity right after Chief Martin stormed out of her house in anger? Could it really be a coincidence? Or was Uncle Sunday working for Chief Martins, playing his part in a bigger scheme? The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. David's blind optimism. But the most painful part of it all, the part that stung her heart the most, was David's reaction. He hadn't even paused to consider the possible dangers, the risks, the hidden motives. He hadn't asked, "Sandra, how did this offer come about? Who is funding this trip? Is this truly from God?" No. Instead, he had rushed to celebrate what could very well be a carefully crafted deception. She shook her head in disappointment. David was wise. David was discerning. David was godly. But tonight, David had failed. And that failure scared her. What would happen to their business? What would happen to their relationship? What would happen to their future? She pulled her blanket over her shoulders, her thoughts spinning in endless circles. A heavy sigh escaped her lips as she whispered a silent prayer. "God, I don't understand what is happening. But please, show me the truth before it is too late." With that, she drifted off to sleep. Please subscribe. The sharp ringing of Sandra's phone jolted her out of sleep. She squinted at the screen. David. Her heart skipped a beat. "Meet me at the lakeside. Urgent." That was all his message said. Sandra didn't need to be told twice. She jumped out of bed as though responding to an emergency, her heart racing. What could be so urgent? She rushed to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, brushed her teeth in haste, and pulled on a simple dress. She didn't bother greeting anyone. She didn't bother informing her parents where she was going. She dashed out of the house. Sandra arrived at their secret meeting spot, the quiet lakeside where they always met whenever there was an issue too serious to discuss over the phone. She sat on the old wooden bench, the cool breeze blowing gently against her skin. But David was nowhere to be seen. Minutes turned into half an hour. Half an hour felt like eternity. She drummed her fingers on her lap. Then she bent down, picking up small pebbles from the ground, tossing them absent-mindedly. A part of her wanted to call him to ask why he was keeping her waiting. But just as she reached for her phone, he appeared. Sandra looked up and gasped. David's face was pale, tired, and worried. He looked like a man who hadn't slept for days. Without a word, he walked to her and sat down beside her. His silence was loud. Sandra waited. And waited. But David said nothing. She didn't know whether to be patient or to get angry. She wanted him to say something. Anything. But he just sat there, staring into the distance. Sandra sighed. She bent down again and picked up another pebble, rolling it between her fingers, silently praying that David would break this suffocating silence. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. Her patience ran out. She stood up abruptly, dusting off her dress, making a move to leave. If he wasn't going to talk, she wasn't going to sit there like a statue. But just as she turned to leave, David's hand reached out, gently pulling her back to the seat. "Please subscribe." Sandra's heart pounded. He cleared his throat. He was finally ready to speak. To be continued. What do you think David is about to say? David's hand still rested on Sandra's wrist, his grip gentle but firm, an unspoken plea for her to stay. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered herself back onto the bench. The wind rustled the leaves around them, the stillness of the lake mirroring the tension in the air. David sighed deeply, rubbing his hands together as though searching for the right words. Then, finally, he spoke. "Sandra, I had a dream." Sandra's heart skipped a beat. David never joked about dreams. Whenever he had a dream, it always carried weight, a message, a warning, a revelation. She turned slightly to face him, her fingers still toying with the small pebbles on her lap. David's voice was low, yet every word seemed to echo around them. "In the dream, we were walking along a beautiful lake just like this one." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. The familiarity of the setting sent shivers down her spine. David continued, his eyes distant as if he were still trapped in the vision. "We were walking side by side, hand in hand. The path was peaceful. The air was cool. The waters beside us were calm, reflecting the golden light of the evening sun. It was perfect." Sandra swallowed. "Then, suddenly, you stopped." David turned to look at her. "You stopped walking and stared across the lake, your eyes fixed on something far ahead." Sandra felt a strange uneasiness creeping up her spine. "I followed your gaze," David continued, "and that's when I saw it, the other side of the lake." His voice dropped to a whisper, as if afraid of what he was about to say next. The grass on the other side was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was dazzling. Green, lush, luxurious, flourishing like the Garden of Eden itself. The trees stood tall and majestic, the flowers bloomed in colors I couldn't even name. It was paradise. Sandra felt her pulse quicken. David's fingers clenched together. Your face lit up. You turned to me and said, "David, look. That side is better. More beautiful. I must go there." Sandra opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I grabbed your hand," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you, Sandra, don't go. We don't know what's over there." But you didn't listen. A lump formed in Sandra's throat. David inhaled sharply. "Before I could stop you, you pulled away from me, waved goodbye, and..." He paused, closing his eyes briefly as if reliving the moment. "You ran. You ran so fast, Sandra. Straight to the edge of the water." Sandra felt her fingers tighten around the pebbles in her palm. "I chased after you, calling your name. But you didn't stop. You dived into the lake and began to swim across." David's jaw clenched. "I kept screaming, begging you to turn back. But you didn't. You reached the other side and climbed out of the water, breathless, victorious. But then, everything changed." Sandra held her breath. David's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "The moment you set foot on that land, the beautiful scenery disappeared. The green grass withered into brown patches of dry, lifeless hay. The flowers shriveled into thorns. The towering trees collapsed into rotten stumps. And the air." David's voice turned hoarse. The air was thick with the stench of death. Sandra's heart pounded. David's eyes darkened. "It wasn't paradise, Sandra. It was a valley, a deep, muddy, stinking valley filled with filth, darkness, and despair." Sandra felt a chill wash over her. "You turned around, looking for me. But there was a wide gap between us. The river had grown bigger, angrier, wilder. The waters raged like a storm, separating us completely." David swallowed hard. "And then, I woke up." A long silence stretched between them. Sandra's mind was spinning. The wind whispered through the trees, but neither of them moved. She felt her chest rise and fall, her heart slamming against her ribcage. David turned to her, his gaze piercing through her soul. Sandra. His voice was barely above a whisper. Don't cross that river. Her lips parted, but she couldn't speak. He didn't need to explain the meaning of the dream. She already knew. South Africa. The job opportunity. Her uncle. Her parents' desperation. It was all a deception. A beautiful, enticing deception. And she had almost fallen for it. Sandra shuddered. The thought of what could have happened if David had not shared this dream. She buried her face in her hands. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. David reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Sandra, you have a choice to make. Her fingers tightened into fists. She knew what she had to do. But was she strong enough to do it? Please subscribe. David sighed deeply, rubbing his palms together as he struggled to find the right words. His eyes, weary from the weight of the night before, locked onto Sandra's. Do you know why I came late? He asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Sandra shook her head, her heart pounding with anticipation. David exhaled slowly. I spent the entire night praying. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. I prayed until dawn, seeking clarity, seeking strength. By the time I finally drifted into sleep, it was barely for an hour. I woke up at 6 a.m., exhausted but determined. The first thing I did was pick up my phone to call you. I needed to see you immediately. I needed to tell you everything. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking slightly. But just as I was about to step out of the house, my parents called me. Sandra's brows furrowed. They said we needed to talk. Urgently. I told them I had an important appointment with you, but they insisted now or never, they said. David clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. So, I sat down, waiting, wondering what could be so urgent that they were willing to keep me from you. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. And then they dropped the bombshell. Sandra's heartbeat quickened. They said they had received several messages from your parents, warnings, threats. They were told, in clear terms, to tell me to stay away from you. Sandra gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. David nodded grimly. Your parents made it clear that if I didn't listen, they would make sure I suffered for it. They would get me arrested. Jailed. Destroyed. Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. David's voice was quieter now, but the weight of his words was heavier than ever. I told my parents not to worry. That I wasn't afraid. That threats from men don't move me, because I serve a God greater than any threat. He sighed deeply, shaking his head. But they wouldn't hear it. They begged me, pleaded with me to break things off with you. They said they didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. That they couldn't bear the thought of what your parents might do. Sandra's chest tightened. I tried to reason with them. I explained everything, our struggles, our faith, our love. I told them that giving up on you wasn't an option. But they wouldn't listen. He laughed bitterly. And when they saw that I wasn't going to change my mind, they said, fine. Then tell Sandra to come and see us. If she's the one stopping you from leaving, let us talk to her ourselves. David's expression darkened, his voice thick with emotion. And then they said something that broke me. Sandra's breath hitched. What? She whispered. David looked away, his hands gripping his knees. They said, a bad wife can be managed. But bad in-laws? That's a lifetime of suffering. Silence hung between them like a thick fog. Sandra felt her stomach twist. David turned to her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Pain, determination, maybe even fear. That's why I was late, Sandra. I had to choose listen to them or run to you. And I ran. Sandra's lips parted, but no words came out. David reached for her hand, his touch warm, reassuring. I don't know what's coming next, he admitted. But I do know one thing. I'm not leaving you. Not now. Not ever. Sandra swallowed the lump in her throat. The war had begun. And now, it was time to fight. Please subscribe. Sandra took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the intensity of everything that had been revealed. She locked eyes with David, her gaze steady and unwavering. "The dream is clear, David. Crystal clear." David swallowed hard, nodding as he listened. "This whole South Africa issue? It's a trap. A well-orchestrated setup by my parents, Uncle Sunday, and their benefactor Chief Martins. And you were the only ignorant one." David flinched slightly at her words, but Sandra quickly reached for his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "But I bless God, David. He has cleared the fog for you. He has given you clarity. You see, secret things belong to God, but the things revealed belong to us. Now we know the truth." She paused, shaking her head as she recalled yesterday's bitter disappointment. "Do you remember my reaction when you were going on and on about all the wonderful opportunities waiting for us in South Africa? Did you see any excitement in me? Did you notice how unmoved I was by all your sweet words?" David looked away, guilt flashing across his face. "I was even annoyed," Sandra continued, her voice soft but firm. "And then you said something that hurt me deeply. You suggested we run away." "No, David. No. I will not run away from this battle." David turned back to her, his face now full of realization. "Winners never quit, and quitters never win," Sandra declared passionately. "Whatever my parents do, whatever the church says, whatever Chief Martins tries, none of them is strong enough to kill my love for you. The only thing I need is exactly what you did when you woke up from that dream. You prayed. You sought God. And when your parents tried to break you, you defended me." David's grip on her hand tightened. "You said your parents wanted to see me?" Sandra asked. "Fine. I will go. I will face them. But hear me, David, my mind is already set. The only thing that can separate me from you is you. If one day you wake up and tell me, 'Sandra, it's over between us,' I will gladly run away from you with joy." David's entire body stiffened. His jaw clenched. His free hand formed a tight fist as he cut her off. "Never." His voice was strong, unshaken, carrying the weight of a vow. Sandra's heart swelled at his response. A soft smile spread across her face as she felt the last remnants of doubt melt away. Without another word, David tugged her up from the seat. "Let's go eat. We need food in our system before we faint from all this stress." Sandra chuckled, nodding as they walked hand in hand toward a nearby restaurant. As they stepped inside, their smiles were radiant, their energy infectious. People turned to look at them, two young lovers beaming with joy, their bond unshaken despite the storm raging around them. A young man, sitting at a table near the entrance, watched them with amusement. As they walked past him, he grinned and called out playfully, "I go lover." Sandra and David burst into laughter, their love speaking louder than any words ever could. The following Sunday, after the church service, Sandra took a deep breath and stepped onto the front porch of David's family home. The house, though modest, exuded warmth and peace, a stark contrast to the tension-filled atmosphere of her own home. David's parents were already seated in the living room, deep in discussion, when they heard a soft knock at the door. David, who had been anticipating her arrival, quickly got up and opened it. As Sandra stepped inside, his parents' eyes widened. The woman standing before them was a vision of grace and poise. Her elegance was undeniable, her beauty striking, and her demeanor calm yet confident. The hostility they had initially harbored, their resolve to separate her from their son, melted away instantly. David's father cleared his throat and gestured for her to sit. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke. "Sandra, my daughter," he began, his voice softer than David had ever heard before. "I must tell you the truth. We have nothing against you or this relationship. Our only fear is the incessant threats from your parents." David's mother nodded in agreement. "Your parents have made it clear that they do not approve, and we do not want to be in conflict with them." Sandra sat still, listening carefully. "But," his mother continued, leaning forward slightly, "if you can win their hearts, if you can get their approval, know that we will stand behind you with joy." Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had expected resistance, more persuasion to leave their son, but instead, she found cautious but open hearts. David's mother reached for her hand gently. "Sandra, I want you to get permission from your parents for me to visit them. I would love to come and see them formally, and together, we can set a date for the introduction ceremony." Sandra smiled warmly. "Mama, I understand your concerns, and I deeply appreciate your wisdom. I promise to do my best. As for my parents," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I will handle them." David's parents exchanged glances, whispering to each other in hushed tones. They had expected a beautiful woman, but they hadn't anticipated the depth of wisdom she carried. She was not just a pretty face, she was thoughtful, intelligent, and strong-willed. David's mother beamed. Wanting to show Sandra just how much she was now a part of their family, she grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the kitchen. "Come, my daughter," she said with a grin. "You must help me prepare lunch. And while we cook, I will teach you a few delicacies from our tribe." Sandra laughed, rolling up her sleeves as she followed. David stood by the doorway, watching them with pride. His mother had accepted Sandra, and his father no longer objected. A battle had been won. As the rich aroma of spices filled the kitchen, laughter echoed through the house. Sandra wasn't just a guest anymore, she was family. Sandra sat frozen, her father's words still ringing in her ears. A poor and useless child. The love of her life, the men she had chosen, the one she had built dreams with, reduced to nothing in her father's eyes. The venom in his voice had been sharper than a dagger, cutting deep into her soul. She had chosen her timing carefully. Her parents had been in high spirits, laughing at some joke her younger brother had made, their faces momentarily free from tension. She had seized the moment, hoping, just maybe, that a softer mood would mean a softer response. She had barely spoken when her father's face darkened in fury. His rage erupted like a volcano, and before she could fully process his words, her mother had reinforced the rejection with even greater finality. She must never come here, unless she wants to witness the greatest embarrassment of her life. And just like that, her hope crumbled. Sandra watched as her parents stormed out of the sitting room, their curses lingering in the air like a bitter aftertaste. Husband and wife, for once, standing in perfect agreement against her. The weight of their rejection pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. David. Her David. Her rock, her safe place, the one person who saw her, who understood her. The man who had prayed with her, fought for her, and stayed when others would have walked away. How could they not see? How could they not understand? Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She tried to hold them back, but it was impossible. A strangled sob escaped her throat, then another, and another. Before she knew it, she was wailing, her body shaking with grief. She cried for David. She cried for herself. She cried for the love they had, the love her parents refused to acknowledge. She cried until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until the world around her disappeared into darkness. And when exhaustion finally claimed her, sleep became her only consolation. The following day, Sandra made her way to David's house, her heart heavy with the burden of the previous night. She had barely slept, her father's cruel words replaying in her mind over and over again. But if there was anyone who could offer her comfort, it was David's mother. As soon as she arrived, David's mother welcomed her warmly, immediately noticing the sadness in her eyes. She didn't rush Sandra to speak, instead, she sat beside her, holding her hand gently, silently letting her know she was safe. Then, with a deep sigh, Sandra poured out everything: her father's rage, her mother's cruel words, the rejection, the pain. She spoke of how broken she felt, how she no longer knew what to do. David's mother listened patiently, nodding with understanding, her grip on Sandra's hand never loosening. When Sandra finally fell silent, exhausted from reliving the ordeal, David's mother pulled her into a warm embrace. "My daughter," she said soothingly, "do not let the words of men define your future. Love is not built on wealth or titles, but on the strength of the heart. If God has brought you and my son together, no one, not even your parents, can separate you." Sandra looked at her, eyes brimming with fresh tears, but this time, they weren't just of sorrow. There was something else: relief. Then, as if determined to lift the heavy cloud surrounding Sandra, David's mother launched into a series of hilarious stories from her youth. She exaggerated her experiences, mimicking voices, making dramatic gestures, until Sandra found herself laughing so hard she could barely breathe. David, who had been watching from a distance, was astonished. Just moments ago, Sandra had been on the verge of tears, and now she was laughing so freely, her body shaking with mirth. Curious, he moved closer to join in their conversation, but the moment he tried to speak, both women turned to him and shouted in unison, "Go away. Don't interrupt us." David raised his hands in surrender, grinning from ear to ear. He had never seen his mother bond so effortlessly with anyone before, and it made him even more certain that Sandra was meant to be part of his family. All right," he said, chuckling. "Just let me know when you're ready to go home, Sandra. It's already late, and I don't want you walking alone." Sandra turned to him with a mischievous smile. "If I can't go home tonight, I'll sleep here with Mummy." David's mother clapped her hands together in delight. "Exactly. My daughter will stay with me." And just like that, the decision was made. That night, Sandra found herself wrapped in the warmth of a home that welcomed her without question, surrounded by love that needed no conditions. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. Please subscribe.